Hello, my name is Andrew, and I am the independent developer behind Scratch Games. This is a video tutorial about the 2D art style I use in 3D space for video games. You may know me best from my recent game, Drew and the Floating Labyrinth, a hand-drawn, traditionally animated 3D puzzle platformer. This style is unique in the way it animates its characters. I've also put up videos in the past about exactly how I developed this style. And I think it's fairly straightforward on how I do it, but some people have asked for a tutorial, and that's what this video is for. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of how I do it so that you could recreate the style yourself. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history behind this style and why I started using it. This style isn't really brand new. Recreate 3D using 2D art. The most obvious example is if you go way back before we actually had 3D models, we still had 3D games with 2D art, pixelated art. The most common examples are things like Doom, Wolfenstein, and other first-person shooters from about 20 years ago. And these worked well, but of course they were pixelated, not too many frames of animation, but you could at least rotate around the characters, and it looked like they had some sort of presence in 3D space. The style that I use basically extends that for modern hardware, where you could rotate not just in one axis, but also like a full 3D third-person camera, you could rotate anywhere. And of course you would use HD art, which makes it look a bit better. We've had some good use of 2D art in other games. Just as an example, I list two independent games here, Don't Starve and Transistor. And they both have beautiful 2D art that looks like it's in a isometric style, and I think Don't Starve does let you rotate the camera a little bit. And the art looks beautiful, great style, but from my personal perspective, I would like to rotate the camera and have that freedom to do so. But to rotate it in all different axes, that hasn't been done before, which is the only difference that my style makes compared to what other people do. And I will mention Time and Eternity, also known as Toki to Toa, a Japanese RPG. This game was advertised as being the first true HD anime video game for using hand-drawn HD anime art. And it was a great example of what I have been looking for a long time, and what some people who love anime and traditional animation have been looking for a long time. But the only issue I've had with this was that the camera is basically fixed behind a certain perspective behind the character at all times. So there is no movement at all. If you rotate the camera, the character just rotates with you, and it looks really unnatural. I can't really fault them for it, because this style does take up a lot of RAM to have all these HD textures. And this was on the PlayStation 3, so it probably couldn't have handled it any better. But it still felt restricting, and it wasn't truly what I was looking for. Hopefully the style that I show you here is a little bit closer to what I hope more games will use in the future. Now, why use traditional animation at all? What's the big deal of it? Traditional animation is almost dead. It's not as common as it used to be. I grew up during the Disney Renaissance in the 1990s. It felt like I was getting a new Disney hand-drawn animated feature every other year, and I looked forward to them. They were fantastic films, and if I go back to them now, I appreciate them even more now than I did when I was a kid. And that you don't get that anymore. They used to have trailers for Disney movies where it would be an upcoming event. They would show you behind the scenes of the animation process. They would show you rough sketches. It was like a behind-the-scenes video in the trailer. And that tried to show you how important and how meaningful the style was. But today, you don't get that. Disney movies sort of come every other year still, but most of them computer animated. Disney doesn't really use 2D art anymore. And they say it's not dead, but they barely use it. And most of their movies are still good, but not nearly as meaningful as they used to be. And it's true for all animation studios in America. In Europe, the style still lives in smaller films. In Japan, it's still as widely used as it used to be. But it feels like it's been pushed to the side in favor of computer animation, which is disappointing. I like to see equalization between all styles being used, if possible. And maybe that's just me, but that's how I like it. And it's not, so yes, 3D models in games is typically common, even in 2D games now. And we've seen cell shading and other techniques to try to make 3D models look more hand-drawn. And it looks good, but it doesn't look like it's really hand-drawn to me. it looks like a whole other style that looks really good, and I don't want that to die either, but it's not what I'm looking for. In Okami, beautiful hand-painted style, but it looks clear that they just added a shader to give outlines to everything. And in a recent game that's coming up soon, the latest Guilty Gear game, then they did a really good job making it look 2D. From this one screenshot, you might think it's 2D art. But in HD, when you see the camera move around, it looks clear that it is using 3D models. The look of it kind of disappears with that. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. So we'll continue on, and let's get into the concept of exactly what I'm doing here, using my style of 2D art and 3D games. Okay, first I will mention that this technique is actually a little bit similar to billboarding, word I found out about after doing all this. It's technically not really billboarding, but what billboarding is you have a flat plane that is always perpendicular to the camera, so that it was always facing you no matter where you move the camera. And this is useful usually for objects really far away. If you just want one plane to represent instead of a full 3D object, then that's a cheaper way to do that. And this isn't exactly the same as that, but it's a little bit similar. This diagram basically tells you exactly what I'm doing. On the object on the left, that is vaguely similar to how I imagine older first-person shooters would have done it, like Doom or Wolfenstein. You have a camera and you have the object, which is the center circle there. And I have 8 different planes around that object. If I draw a straight line from the camera to the player, it should be able to detect one of those planes as being closest to the player. In this case, the red one. The red plane there is just slightly closer to where it hit than where the other object is. And by telling that red plane must be the one I want visible, because that's probably the one closest to being perpendicular to the camera. Perpendicular to the line of sight to the camera. And that's it. So that's, using that design on the left, that's probably how I imagine first-person shooters would have done it, with only one horizontal plane to worry about. To extend this to 3D space, where you could rotate the camera anywhere, you would just add more layers like that vertically. So the object on the right gives you a rough idea of how that would be. Putting objects horizontally makes sense mathematically, but putting them vertically is a little bit different, and that takes a little bit of just testing. Because depending where you place it, the perspective might not look right when you transition between the planes. I would just recommend testing it out through trial and error, deciding what the best angle or what the best distance is to place those objects in. Now, this works well for character animation, best, or even faraway objects. If you do it for faraway objects, you could use the billboarding technique. I do not recommend this for background objects, like buildings or cars or garbage or particles. The reason for that is that this is a time-consuming effort to actually draw by hand every frame. You do have to draw everything by hand. There's no magic there. You can't just magically draw 1 or 2 parts of it and then have the computer do the rest for you. That would be computer animation. You could try that, but it would be more complicated, and it probably won't give you exactly the effect you want. The purpose of this is to allow the artist to draw exactly what they want to see on screen. But it is more time-consuming. So I only recommend it for character animation because that's where I think it gives the most benefit. For stationary objects in the background that don't move, that don't animate, to me, computer animation and models are fine. I think we've gotten to a point where you could look at a screenshot, you could look at a still object in the distance and think it's a painting. We've gotten that far pretty well. Character animation, not so much, because the frames in between the animation, a lot of those are done by the computer. The keyframes are usually done by the animator, but all the frames in between that are usually calculated out, and that's why it looks maybe more realistic, but also less natural and not as... well, I don't know how to describe it. So I would only recommend this for characters or certain objects like that. And before you start going into why you would want to use this technique, I'll compare it to why you would use CGI or why would you use this hand-drawn technique. CGI is technically easier to do. That may not sound right, but technically yes it is. it might not be as intuitive as hand-drawn, as simply drawing something with a pencil. But in terms of how much time it takes, it is easier to make a 3D model using CGI, because if you make the model once, you have every angle covered for. If you use the hand-drawn technique, you will have to hand-draw every angle that you want to put in. And that's why it takes so much more time to do. And also hand-drawn will, therefore, be really hard to change if you want to go back and change something. You can't just change one little thing and it's done for everything. It will take you a long time to do it the first time, and it will take you the same amount of time to do it back a second time. It basically multiplies the effort you have to do. And it's also true for the animation style. If you just draw like one frame of something, that's fine. If it's stationary, that's fine. But to animate it will multiply based on how many frames you want to do. Whereas with CGI models, the animation, you just do it once and it's done for everything, so it's not nearly as time-consuming. And also the 2D style takes a lot of RAM and a lot of hard drive space in the end. So that may not be good for things like mobile devices. But otherwise, it's not that expensive for the CPU or GPU. Almost any computer today can handle this style without a problem. CGI might be more expensive on CPU and GPU, if for nothing else because of the shading, the shadows, and other visual techniques. Because calculating all that does take a lot of time. And generally, the 2D style gives you a unique style that allows the artist to hand draw exactly what they want. The concept art they use for the characters, they can use that directly in-game. That's something that CGI does not do. You can get very close with CGI, but 2D gives you exactly that. No trade-offs there. And this whole style ultimately gives you a brand new way to do something, and this could open up the visual style of games in a whole new direction. Of course, that does depend on your personal ability as an artist. If you cannot draw very well, this isn't worth it. You could probably make a more impressive object in 3D, even if it's ugly as hell. It's still a lot easier and probably would look better than 2D. If you are really good at 2D art, then I highly recommend trying this hand-drawn style out. You might be really impressed with what you get. Now then, let's actually get down to the real tutorial. I use Unity 3D for this because I like it. I'm used to that. But any 3D game engine should be fine. This should work for almost anything. You first make a simple 3D player object. Make sure that it faces the direction that it moves in. So you have to write a script to make sure it moves in whatever direction that the character faces. And then add a plane to the front of it, and then also to the sides. Do it to the front first so that you actually know that it faces the direction that it's going. When you add the extra planes to it, first do it 8 around the side, or more if you like. Then duplicate those layers and add them above. And by the way, here's the general angles and positions of all the faces. You can probably work out the rest from there. You'll notice that the naming of the planes use even numbers. I do that because I found if you double the planes in between, the effect looks nearly perfect. But that does require more RAM, more hard drive space, and you have to draw a lot more, of course. So that's up to you if you think it's worth it. And here's the magic of this. You have to use the code to tell which face should be visible with the camera as you rotate the camera around. So pay attention to that as you copy this. And that's it. This also works really well for 2D games that are made in a 3D environment. I apologize for the ugly 2D cube, but this also gives you a rough idea of how it would work when you put hand-drawn objects on top. And there you are. Thank you for watching. Now, this isn't perfect, of course, and there's a lot of room for improvement. For example, the visible planes, you can make them billboard to the camera while still maintaining their position. This might allow for smoother transitions regarding rotation when the camera rotates. Of course, you would have to make these separate from the existing plane so that there won't be any contradictions when deciding which plane to be visible. You could also try a billboarded plane that follows the camera while taking the visible plane's texture, so that it will look a little bit smoother regarding to position of the texture. You could use a curved surface, for example, just a cylinder in Unity, or just make a curved surface from a modeling software like Blender. And you can make that follow the camera, and that would simulate a really basic shadow and shading that would be a little bit more complex than the linear shading that you have before. And if the character is symmetrical, you could also make this more efficient by duplicating the textures on one half to save up on RAM. And RAM is important, so you want to save up on RAM where possible. You could also consider using multiple planes per perspective on top of each other to simulate a unique form of depth, but this will multiply RAM, so be careful if you do that. There's a lot more you could do. If you are talented and if you are ambitious, you could do a lot with the style. I look forward to see if you do anything with it.